So, welcome everybody. I'm Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here facilitating, maybe would be the right word, this event, rather than chairing. We have with us David Natzler, Sir David Natzler, and we're very, very honoured that David has come for his, I think, would it be fair to say, your first sort of official outing?
Well, my wife's not here, so I'm not
Your first public appearance, or whatever, since retiring as Clerk of the House of Commons, i.e. the most senior official in Parliament, at the end of February, yes? We approached David a couple of months ago to ask, knowing that this was coming up, whether he would do it, and we're absolutely delighted that he agreed to do so. David has always been a very good friend of the unit, very kind and generous with respect to our work, and so it's completely in character that he should come and agree to do this. A little bit of audience participation. I'm thinking this might not go quite as I had anticipated. How many people here were born in 1975 or after?
Yeah.
Yeah, quite a lot, actually. The significance of that date is that that is the year that David first started working in the House of Commons. And so David has worked in the House of Commons for longer than about half the people in this room have been alive. So not only his tremendous insightfulness about the present and the recent past and the future, but maybe a few of his reflections on the longer history of Parliament and how things have developed over that time when he's known the institution so well, I thought would be very nice to hear. So we're going to do this in a conversational format, I hope, where we'll have a discussion for maybe sort of 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open it out for questions from the audience. The way that we're doing this is there is a recording. The conversation between David and I will be recorded, and we will put the recording on our website afterwards, so that will be public. But we will then switch the camera off and go off the record, please, for the questions. So I'm sure you're far too discreet to say indiscreet things even when we're officially off the record, but no tweeting, please, of the later conversation. So I think that's it, and I think we're now starting. So David, all I've given in terms of a clue is that you started working in Parliament in 1975. Could we just start at the beginning and you say how you came to be there, what you were first doing when you arrived, and give a bit of a flavour of the institution at that time? To what extent did it feel the same and different to now? Would there be things looking back at that institution that we find very surprising and strange now?
Well, I think with this audience, I also see some people who were working in Parliament, I think, in 1975, so, or indeed before. I'm open to contradiction. I started working on what was called the European Legislation Committee, virtually at almost its first year. So that was the first thing that was really new and exciting, looking back in mid-1970s, as we just joined the European communities. And we just set up our new structures as to how to deal with this fresh challenge, whereby an unelected Council of Ministers would actually be legislating with direct effect in the UK. And at the time, obviously, I was incredibly young, fresh, and naive.
And handsome, I
and that was merely comparative, no, but that...
Devastatingly so, I heard.
And so Europe was exciting, and it was new, and a system had been set up which had survived for the past 45 years, whereby the House of Lords looked at documents coming out of Europe and reported on their merits, and the House of Commons set up a committee full of busy and enthusiastic and able members whose job it was to sift and identify instruments of importance which would then be debated in the House, which was quite boring, of course, for members to do. We had then quite a lot of staff, and basically in 1974, 72, 73, the committees got it the wrong way around. And it should have been, of course, the Commons that was doing these interesting merits reports, and the Lords should have been engaged in this technical scrutiny, but things do go wrong sometimes. So that's what I started doing, and indeed within a few months actually took the committee away to Brussels and then to Luxembourg to meet the institutions. So it's sort of ironic that, well, here we are in 2019, and it seems, maybe that's not right, but it seems as if that adventure is coming to an end. So I was trying to think what was different. Expectations were different, I think. There were no speech limits. It seems a very minor thing, but it's rather as if you were to say in a university context, or even a talk like this, if you were told that I could be here till well past 9 in the evening, your patience might wear thin. Now, no, it's incredible. But now that we know that things will be brought to an end, and that individual speeches, you can't use the mere length of speeches, is your 3 back, I think. That the mere length of speaking can no longer be used to destroy business. Thinking about it, that's almost one of the biggest changes over the last 200 or 300 years, because up till then, there were all these parliamentary stories about people speaking for a long time, and that, as it were, affecting things. So we were a pretty old-fashioned 18th century parliament still in the 1970s in that way. Public bill committees, then known as standing committees, were not quite as useless as people said, but they were, no one really engaged, and in controversial bills they'd stay at the beginning for as long as possible so as to have the merciful release of a guillotine. Now everything is programmed, and so that we know when the bill is going to come out of committee, and on the report stages they just went through the night until people had enough. All report stages were exempt, and that meant they regularly went to 2 or 3 in the morning, and it didn't mean that anything more interesting or dramatic happened, it just means it went on for longer, and we got more overtime, so that was nice. It was also rather wearing. Contrary to the belief, particularly held probably by those born since 1975, there were select committees. And that's something which I hope may come, because I think it's really interesting, and there are some people, actually, Jack, there are some people who worked on those pre-1979 committee system. And in 1975, it wasn't just the European Legislation Committee, which was bright and new and shiny. There was the Expenditure Committee that had, I think, 8 subcommittees, each of which looked after 2 or 3 departments, so obviously not the full departmental system that we've had since '79. There was the Nationalised Industries Committee and its subcommittees. There's already the Public Accounts Committee, as there still is, as well as the odd committee like Science and Technology and Race Relations and Immigration. So the thing didn't spring fully fledged from the Procedure Committee's mind in 1978. There had been a steady drip of that reform towards select committees. And I suppose the other thing, which sounds very techie, but you bear with me, it is constitutional, is that the House of Commons was not independent when I joined. It was fiscally dependent on the government. Looking back into essays in the 60s about parliamentary reform, one of the areas is, why can't the committees be better staffed? And who was it that was stopping them being properly staffed? And the answer is it was the Treasury, because the Treasury had a control over the financing of the House of Commons. So the House had no organ by which you could say, this is what we, the House of Commons, wants. It had to go cap in hand and say, could we have 1 1/4 clerical officers? And the answer would be no. So one of the unexpected changes, and one that I think at the time no one probably grasped the full significance of, is just about 40 years ago, which is setting up the House of Commons Commission, which is fiscally independent. So I just want to, because I think, again, a lot of people don't know about that, but when you think of it, that is the path to quite a lot of other things, some good, some not so good.
Very interesting. I mean, I think reform is going to be a theme through this, reform past and reform future, possibly. It does sound like, on balance, I think those were changes for the good. We may hear about some things, maybe, who knows, we may hear some things about which were less good. But can I just to sort of take us through your time, ask you what else you did, having, you did that job, and then you did a whole series of other jobs, and I guess there were probably some pretty fascinating things that you were sort of a bystander to, or perhaps even a player in, that happened during those early to sort of mid bits of parts of your career?
Well, I guess they were fascinating to me. They'd never been fascinating to anyone else. Well, I was lucky because I was there just at the start of the 79 Select Committee system. And those there before me, including Jackie was there, were lucky enough. They got a full Select Committee. But I just scraped in to get a subcommittee in this grand new world of the St. John Stevens reforms. That's what we were promised. This was going to be something different. We were going to be like Congress. We were gods walking on the earth. And it was great fun, so those first few years, because the government was shocked. I think civil society out there was very eager to join in and help. I think we maybe underestimate that the whole Select Committee system depends on having civil society there to participate and willing to give their experiences. So I was the first published Select Committee report under the new system. It was mine. It was an absolute disaster. It was the only time it was actually panned in a third leader in the Times. Because it sat on the fence on a distant subject of immigration back in 79-80.
No, we don't talk about that anymore.
No, quite. No, this is different. This is fiancé immigration in the Commonwealth. So this is amazing how the dogs have ceased to bark on that. But then I suppose the Suss inquiry, which was, looking back, one of the things that I thought I was proudest of, but I haven't quite researched what happened. But it is an early case of a Select Committee inquiry apparently having an effect. So Suss was Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act, which was being used to arrest people not trying to commit an offence, but for being suspicious that they might be about to commit an offence. And that was in itself an offence from the 1824 Act. And it was used by the police to control pickpockets and casual thieving. But it was disproportionately applied to young black men. And there was a very young solicitor called Paul Boating set up a Scrap Suss campaign in 79-80. And the subcommittee, which was under fairly liberal leadership, took it on. And I remember writing 3 days over Whitson, writing this brilliant report that argued that it should go. You know, I like reading it still. Within weeks, the government had agreed to give way, and it was scrapped and replaced by the Criminal Attempts Act. What I then discovered as the years went by was what I think what happened...
Is that a sign? Just to
Yes,
stop.
no,
The way that Select Committees work is very subtle, which is something that I've written about now and presumably back then. Is that the sort of thing that just wouldn't have happened without the, would that have happened through other channels, or did the Select Committee really facilitate that in a way that
it facilitated it, but in an unexpected way to me. That it wouldn't really matter if I had written down a series of algorithms or rhymes by Edward Lear. Because what happened was that the then Home Secretary, Mr. Whitelaw, was very keen to get rid of the Suss law, and the only people standing his way were the Metropolitan Police. So he was then able to summon in the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, which I understand he did, and said, "I'm frightfully sorry, these complete incompetents in the House of Commons seem to think it must go. And therefore, it is with the deepest regret that I have to tell you that." And so it wasn't the argument that persuaded anyone, but it was the occasion to say to it now. It did get and I guess that's not the only
perfect little
time.
vignette of the subtlety of how these dynamics
Isn't
can work.
it? And you don't know it till afterwards, and certainly I didn't know it at the time, or till some time afterwards. And other things you don't know till years afterwards. So I'm beginning to go to the Public Record Office to look at some of the things in which I did have a hand, to see what it looked like to the civil service. Who I guess we also forget, to whom this was quite a shock. Civil servants at the time here. I mean, it was... So I'm really interested to see how, what echo there was, and where you don't think there is any, then actually someone is reading this, not necessarily the report, but they're reading the evidence from the people and saying, gosh, we do actually have a problem with job centres, young black men not able to access job centres and so on. Whereas at the time you feel you're just wasting your time.
Well, Select Committees can put things on the agenda, can't they? Get focus.
Yes, and of course Select Committees, and I know here and at the IFG you go around this, sometimes you think, is it enough just to say we're going to inquire into something and then perhaps not actually bother to do it? And that has already created about 30% of the impact, not the 100%, but it has created it because people think, gosh, if this is worth looking into, we better prepare a defensive position and also incidentally find out what is going on in his area.
Yeah, and brief the minister, and the minister then says,
Yes.
what? That's our policy?
Yes, I can't defend that, and I will defend it in front of the committee, of course, and the answer will give nothing away, but we are going to slowly, like the barge in the Thames, slowly shift as the tide changes. So yes, so the early days of the select committee system were exciting as we got more staff and members got more engaged in it, and they became more determined to make a go of it, both personally and professionally. We still had chairs who preferred to be an Under-Secretary of State to be a chairman of a select committee, which was sad. I think that's declining. I think that they really now do see this as, especially now they're fully elected by the House, as you know. I suppose another change which certainly affected me, and I guess it was the whole international situation in the sort of 1990s, early 90s, which again may not be obvious to some younger people, that the Cold War ended. And I think that changed things more than perhaps we realised, even in Parliament. It's quite difficult to put your finger on where. And I was doing the Defence Committee at the time, so it was very obvious where. So we were the first select committee to go after the end of the war. We went to Moscow, to the Tank Academy. And I saw for the first time a Crusader gearbox being taught to Russian tank engineers, which was surprisingly got hold of one. And to East Germany, to the Russian troops in East Germany, and so on. So that was, looking back, utterly thrilling. Changing peace in Northern Ireland after all those years of going over to see the Troubles. So that ended. So the sort of early 1990s was, I think, quite a watershed. I'm not quite sure how it affected Parliament, but I think it probably did. And then came, obviously, the expenses scandal. It was, I suppose, I was thinking the next
Another high point.
Yes, that was a low point, and looking back, we made mistakes. I made mistakes. There were opportunities to avert that were missed. We knew freedom of information was coming. And we absolutely sure that the one thing that everybody would fixate on would be the travel expenses of members going on overseas delegations. So we buttoned that down fantastically. You won't find a penny out of place in that. But I think too many, certainly staff, and presumably some members, were simply unaware of the dripping roast that was lying behind the way members were using their expenses. But they should have known. They knew, they were warned at the start of the Parliament, 2005 Parliament, by their whips, get yourself cleaned up because FOI is coming in. And of course it wasn't FOI that exposed the expenses scandal. You can stop me if I'm wandering.
No.
Again, it's worth remembering what actually happened, is everything was put on a disc, alas, and the disc was stolen. But everything was on the disc, a lot of it would have been redacted quite properly, addresses and so on. And if the redacted information, which some of us were busy redacting, which means putting a black marker pen through some details, I don't think would have brought the place down. So FOI didn't, in a way. It was, the incidental result of FOI was that we had to work out what to publish, so the thing was to put everything on disc, so as to make it easier to work out what not to publish, rather than doing it all on paper. Isn't that ironic? And then the disc gets stolen and sold. I mean, straightforwardly sold in a commercial marketplace, and that was exposed. But what did that lead to, the expenses scandal, if this is in conversation? You know what it led to. It led to two things, and one is the resignation of the then Speaker, and not only the election, inevitably, of a new Speaker, but for the first time, a hustings election for the new Speaker, so that not just the new Speaker, but actually some of his competitors came with a reform programme which they had pre-announced to their electorate. And that, I think, is a really interesting.
Yeah.
And again, thinking about it, it only just occurred to me recently how strange that is. Because
and that was the result, wasn't? I mean, I've explained this recently to my students. This chain of events. That was a result of a reform that came about. I think it was 2001, wasn't it? After the election of Speaker Martin. So we think that all of this change was the use of that system. The first use of that system came as a result of the expenses crisis. So the change to the system wasn't actually a result of the expenses crisis itself.
No, that's a very good point. The change in the means of electing the Speaker, and that was brought about by a sense of discontent a little bit at what had happened. Not, I hasten to say, the outcome necessarily in 2000, but the feeling that the old-fashioned system
general
of doing
chaotic nature of those elections in, if it was 2001.
where you have an alternative put into. Well, for the Speaker, it was an alternative is put, and you then dealt with the alternatives before you get to the main person proposed, and that isn't a logical way of doing it. And it was known that a lot of other people did something different, particularly in Canada. In 1986, they introduced in Canada a, again, I don't know how much time we have, a humorously incompetent system. Is anyone here from Canada? They're back there. Well, I attended it, oddly enough, as I was a clerk on attachment at the time. I couldn't have been luckier. And they had a system, very wide, of secret ballot. They didn't announce the results of the ballot at the end of each round. They simply announced who had been eliminated. That was the first weakness, which we've done away with. The second weakness was you didn't go in for the ballot. You had to positively send your name in to be out of the ballot. Which still embarrasses my Canadian friends when I remind them of this, because they never cease to do that. So, the ballot the election took place shortly after a holiday period. So they all came back from holiday. So many of them had forgotten to send in their pleas for the Speaker. So there was something like 132 candidates. And they were embarrassed, many of them, that they were in that. And then came the results. And the results were not read out, and I happened to have seen the results because I was behind the scenes. And a lot of people got 0, and a lot of people got 1. And all the people who got 0 got eliminated, but none of the people who got 1 did get eliminated. So you saw dawning in the faces of these politicians that thought, oh, maybe I'm a more significant figure. No one can tell them you're not. You voted for yourself, no one else. So it took an awful, it was about 4 in the morning, and they had an annunciator system, but they didn't want to show anything, so they played Vivaldi's 4 Seasons on a continuous loop. So it was a nightmare. Anyway, so drawing on that, the procedure committee finally did bite the bullet and said, let's have, which is quite a radical proposition, because it was proposing a secret ballot. And again, I'm open to contradiction. There were secret ballots occasionally in the 18th century, I think, where they had a glass bowl for committee places. But effectively, in the modern era, the idea you would have a secret ballot is quite counterintuitive to the House of Commons, where every vote should be recorded. You know, the constituents should know how you voted. And to have an eliminatoire, to have a system whereby people are eliminated for what reason. So it's quite a radical proposition. Of course, they knew there was a long time to wait till it would happen. But when it did happen, you're absolutely right. It was in its result. Well, we know its result was to have a reforming speaker. I mean, it's possible that George Young would have been a pretty reforming speaker. He was, if you remember, the shadow leader who then committed himself to the Wright committee reforms, which was crucial, and persuaded David Cameron of them while in opposition. So they were stuck with them when they were in government. And that's George Young.
And there might be, we can't avoid the B word, and I think Brexit we will come to, maybe not straight away, but just hold the thought that maybe there's some kind of a parallel here between this and the desire for people to have indicative votes.
You must hold that thought, maybe. I can't hold thoughts.
What else was I going to say? In terms of the speaker election, one of the other things that I say to my students, and you might just want to nod and we'll pass on and get back to some other things, but is what political scientists would refer to as the relationship between structure and agency, which I think is what you're saying, that the fact that there were these hustings actually changed the nature of the contest and changed the incentives for the contestants. And so when people say that the speaker that we have now has behaved differently to speakers that we've had in the past, that's not necessarily about his personality per se, it's the structure that was created and the incentives that were created by an all-house election and hustings and so on. The interplay between all these things is really interesting, I think.
I'm not going to just nod, because to be fair, there could have been hustings without a secret ballot election. And there could have been hustings in 2000. There was no rule against it.
Yeah.
And it is interesting. I think it was Ruth. I know Ruth is here.
I think I saw Ruth Fox.
I think it was the Hansard Society that said there should be hustings. Yeah. I don't think it wasn't said. Yeah. No, I mean it wasn't in the rules. And nothing, as I say, would have stopped it in 2000. And I suspect there were hustings in 2000 in some privacy. And there certainly were, members who would go around saying this is the way I propose to behave. So I wouldn't overstate that, actually. I think, as I said, if George Young, who was the loser in the final ballot, had got through, he might have gone out less into the country to talk to schools. But he might not. I mean, he's praising George as a sort of serious parliamentary personality.
Yeah.
But it certainly, the thing was surprisingly public and in your face, and this is a big election. And of course, it was then the Speaker's initiative, which has so far had no significant impact in the same way, to say, I think the deputies should also now be elected by a secret ballot in the same way, which was a shock. I don't think people had really thought of that. The deputies had always been elected by a cosy agreement between the front benches and just 3 names put forward. And so when we came up with the Wright Committee with select committee chairs being elected by the whole House, and unquestionably, electioneering like mad, as they did, they still do, it wasn't completely new, was it? It's worth thinking that I think it was a real help that the duck had been broken by the Speaker, by it being done for the Speaker, and then it being, it wasn't immediately done from memory until 2010, but it being set up that the deputy speakers would also have this. And it does change the atmosphere of the place being run by a slightly cosy fraternity of the usual channels and the 2 party front benches. So that it was one of the things that has changed in 40 years.
I think there's a bit of a dynamic there, isn't there, of several of the things that you've spoken about, and particularly this thing about the Speaker elections. I think you mentioned the word expectations at the beginning, are about higher expectations, more demands coming from MPs for decision making, which drives change, which then drives expectations perhaps even higher. But you've mentioned the Wright Committee a lot, but you haven't, just for the benefit of those who don't know, your role in the Wright Committee was you were clerk of the Wright Committee. And have you raised it, has it been coming up as sort of one of your proud moments?
Of course it has, Meg. I mean, those of you who don't know, Meg was the specialist advisor on it. So the clerk's job is to hold the pen, as they say in the United Nations. But, yes, I mean, when it came up, and one or two other people who might have been asked to do it, because it came up in a funny way. And again, history is interesting, isn't it? In 10 years, is it long enough back? I'm not sure how it happened. Tony Wright wrote a letter to Gordon Brown in the middle of the expenses scandal, saying he wanted there to be, not the first time, Tony Wright, who is, those who don't know, was a reforming Labour MP, ex-political academic, or still political academic.
Part-time professor at UCL,
here,
indeed, in this department.
but an academic and a reformer, and very interested in the Constitution. I think fair to say more interested in the Constitution, perhaps, in some ways, than in procedure, and more drenched in it.
Although what you say indicates very much that you cannot separate these two, because some of these things that look very boringly, nerdishly procedural turn out to have...
I've never found anything procedural to be either boring or nerdish. It's like saying to men who invent, or women who invented DNA, it's just a lot of little balls on a string. There's nothing nerdish about it. So they are important, is what I say, and they're real, they grip and they change people's lives, it's not, they do. So Tony wrote to the Prime Minister saying, "Dear Gordon, what I think this expenses scandal means is that we need to have a big constitutional convention," to which Gordon's advisors must have thought, I don't quite see the connection. But I think in the letter, from memory, he also said something, he simply probably wrote the letter. There's something vague about, and also a group of MPs charged with improving procedures in the House. It was definitely a second bit of the letter. But it was that bit that someone at number 10, and I've never known who, it may have been Gordon Brown himself, leapt on and thought, here's an idea, either as a distraction mechanism, or, which would be perfectly logical to make members feel better about themselves, because it was, those of you, many of you were around in May, June 2009, we were in a very low place. And I think it's forgotten how low by those who are not there. People were suicidal. When I say suicidal, members were on suicide watch, and the welfare service was stretched. Their families were being spat at in supermarkets. You were hearing terrible stories about what was happening to members, different from the current ghastly bullying and threats, but also so bizarre, and at that time, I think, quite unexpected. And it was irrelevant whether there were people who'd done anything wrong or not. So it was a very miserable place. It was like a school where something had just gone utterly wrong. So this was a good idea to raise it, saying let's look at particular aspects of procedure. And the government were they behind it? They put the motion down, but they didn't really want to lose control of the agenda. So there was a standoff for about 4 weeks, as I recall, when the committee was sort of forming in terms of the members, and Tony realised that it was
who were elected, of course, weren't they? That was an innovation. You remember
well,
the
they weren't
political
whole
parties?
house elected, but
No,
the
but the political parties
believed to have
elected their
elected them.
members.
I believe they did,
Yeah.
yes. I know of it, but they said they did. They did, didn't they?
I believe
think
they did.
I hope they did.
But that was a sign of what was coming.
That it was a sign that they were taking control, taking back control, taking some sort of control. And then the government in the end lost and had to give way on what the committee could and couldn't look at. So it then sat very rapidly. I was determined to be the clerk and not let anyone else have the fun of this, because I knew it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. So we sat through the summer and the autumn, as you will both know. We didn't take any evidence. We had a couple of seminars at which some people, distinguished academics attended, and some undistinguished academics. And then we just had, as I recall, week after week, or actually twice a week, we just had group arguments. Which
There were some pretty big characters on that committee, weren't there? I mean, people who'd been banging on, if you like, about reform for years. People like Graham Allen, Andrew Tyree, pretty big personalities.
That is what, looking back, is interesting, is how they all managed to agree, or nearly all managed to agree. I think Natasha Engel and one other were the only two who at the end signed a minority report. And out of it came the direct election of select committee chairs, which I confess to having been doubtful about, which I think has proved a success rather than a failure, in the sense that they feel appointed by the House, they have a status, they give their select committees a status. Most of them don't hack off their members too badly. And the Backbench Business Committee, which is an example, and a fascinating example of something which no member that I know had ever heard of. And it was entirely because of your research with Akash with Akash, who'd gone to Australia, to the Senate.
Well, both
houses.
houses. No, it was the Chamber. It was the House of Representatives, I think, primarily.
Okay. But they had this Backbench Business Committee, and they wrote this very, very long booklet about it that I hadn't read, I must confess, but I knew was there. And then the idea came up, sort of thing. We brought it up, and Tony knew about it. And everybody latched onto it. And it's an interesting thought, if there hadn't been the money for that, if Akash and you hadn't done this, you'd done something else, would we have a Backbench Business Committee, which is one of the successes of the last 10 years.
Supposing we were in a world where the Nuffield Foundation didn't fund research on Parliament.
Hard to believe. But it is interesting. What would have happened is they would have said, we will take back, I think they still have said, we've lost something, that members don't have the power to affect the agenda at all. By wasting our Thursdays in particular with sterile debates with about 4 members, so an undersecretary can make a 1-hour-long statement that the department want them to make about something of no significance, and we all go home early, which was very debilitating for about 30 years. So we'd have said, though, well, I think the Speaker, same as the German debates, we'd better put it in the hands of the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker, as we did with Westminster Hall. But we didn't, and it was a more democratic proposition to say, well, members will elect a committee, including a chair, who will then go away and will act as a star chamber, as a sounding board, and you must make your case to them, and then they will then bring forward debates. And my goodness, they brought forward debates, and they still are. And they have, I think they've changed the landscape quite significantly. It was, of course, a backbench business debate, which warms the cockles of all our hearts, that first, I think, had a vote on a referendum on Brexit. And showed 89, from memory, Conservative members in favour of such a referendum, which is said to have given Conservative whips a very nasty shock, although they should have known. But also raised subjects that had been suppressed by the 2 front benches, the blood scandal. Hillsborough was first, was a background. I mean, serious subjects that affect people. So, you know, with the 10 years on the Backbench Business Committee, they have a lot to be proud of, and obviously a lot of the debates are quite dull to most people, but we didn't, of course, get the House Business Committee, which was going to have the entire agenda of the House, as it were, set democratically by a bureau, which is the standard European continental style, and indeed in Scotland. and which in a majority administration probably doesn't make much difference, to be honest. If it comes to voting, they'll win. They'll say, no, we're definitely having a full day second reading on Tuesday, that's it. But of course, in a minority administration, I almost dread, although we tend to think, how we would have coped with the House Business Committee in the last 18 months, or how the House Business Committee would have coped with the fissures, not only between the parties, but primarily within the parties, as to what the House is actually to do. But it remains an oddity, doesn't it not, that the House of Commons does not control its own agenda.
Yeah.
It's tremendously sovereign, and it has huge aspirations, and it has all these privileges that it can plead. But actually, its agenda is largely controlled of its own volition. I mean, it can end Standing Order 14, but is controlled by ministers.
Well, it's very interesting what you say. How would a backbench business committee have been managed in the current climate? I think my take on it would be slightly different, which is I was always a bit sceptical, the House Business Committee.
Oh, wow.
I was always a bit sceptical about a House Business Committee, I suppose partly for the reasons that you indicate, because when a government has a majority, it's going to watch very carefully who its members are on that committee, and it's not going to let go of control. But we didn't really anticipate that we might be heading for minority government territory, when actually it might have been quite useful, because it would have been a mechanism for taking decisions.
Yes, it's an interesting thought, and your students can do some work on how it works in Scotland, because obviously Scotland's had two minority administrations, and their bureau has survived. Now, we have talked to the Scots about how that happens, and they have the odd defeat, but generally it's because obviously the discussions don't take place in the bureau, they've already taken place, but instead of which we've had to come up with this, not bizarre, but this quite unusual let-win bowls, Cooper, whatever, mechanism, by which, by way of an amendment to a draft resolution, you make an order that supersedes Standing Order 14. I hope this isn't techie. Supersedes the government's control of the agenda and says this is what we're going to debate actually on Wednesday or something or other, and that is what we are ordering, and we have full power to do it. And it is odd doing it by way of an amendment to a resolution. There's getting around
rather than having a standard mechanism.
A mechanism of saying if this is what the majority of the House wants to have, well then this is what the House is going to have by way of the debate, while still preserving. But you're absolutely right, Meg, you warned us against the House Business Committee and that we wouldn't get it.
So it's my
You were right about the second, you were probably right about the first. I don't think we were ready for it then, and I suppose the question is, are we ready for it now? To which the answer might be absolutely not, that would be chaos worse confounded. At least we know, at least some of the time we know where we are. Although the ground does seem to shift at times. And the other right thing, stop me if this is, the other right thing of which I'm not particularly proud, I didn't set this up, but which I'm really thrilled by is the Petitions Committee, which wasn't a direct product of Wright, but Wright said, if you remember the third bit of the Wright report,
wasn't it?
well, it was from the members' point of view. I mean, it wasn't from, we had something about public participation was meant to be in it. And I don't think it's a secret to say that the words public participation and members of parliament do not always sit easily. You sort of get it in a way. I mean, they have been elected at some considerable personal inconvenience to represent all of you and me. And they don't really then like a bunch of us getting together and saying, this is what you're going to debate, this is what you're going to decide, this is what we think about X. I mean, they're interested in knowing, but they understandably reckon they can mediate it. So it's rather like NHS Direct, you know, it hacks off some GPs, I'm told. Some may be very relieved, but I mean, they feel they're there to sort of help them. So that section of the report, I think I wrote it pretty much on my own. We did a little research into what happened in about Volksbegehren, people's initiatives in advanced countries like Austria. So I got Austrian. But the members weren't interested in any of that. But the petitions thing, we got to say something should happen. And it just took 5 years for it to happen, which is an embarrassment. And the procedure committee went off on the wrong track and tried to set up an incredibly expensive one. And in the end, as you maybe all know, in 2015, we set up, basically we annexed the government site, which is extremely nicely put together, cheap and simple and effective. And it's now a jointly run site. And members of the public, and again, I hope you've all done it, can sign a petition or start one off. And in 6 or 7 years, and I'll be, I hope, contradicted by someone who knows the latest figures. My memory is we've had 14 million distinct people sign.
And of course, if you
is just, if someone had said 10 years ago, someone had said to us, we've discovered a Parliament, in one way or another, can get in touch directly with 14 million people, we wouldn't have known where to look.
And for the analysis, you turn to Christina Laston-Maniera, who's at the back.
Yes,
Will
I
give us
can
the
see.
lowdown on
It's more than
all
40
of
million.
this.
I bet it is.
Yeah, 40 million was the first parliament.
Well, it can't go down, can it? So it must be.
We are in danger of eating into these people's time, and I'm breaking the pledges that I made in terms of timing. But I feel I do want to ask you, just because we've only just really started dipping our toes a little bit in the future. We've done the past, but goodness me, 40-something years in 40 minutes is a bit challenging. But looking ahead, I mean, some of these things that you're talking about, you know, Standing Order 14 and House Business Committees and things would have made most people fall off their chairs with boredom a few years ago. And now we're reading about them on Twitter, we're reading about them on the front pages of the newspapers. Brexit has done all this. Brexit has focused attention on parliamentary procedure in a way, well, I don't know, you have a longer memory, certainly within my memory, as never before, maybe within yours as well.
That's entirely right.
Do you think that there are particular things that Brexit has shown up to not work about Parliament that now need dealing with? Are there things that we should be worrying about in some sense in the way, in some of these directions? I mean, one of them is broadly the whole relationship between government and Parliament. A lot of what we've been talking about has kind of led up to a situation where Parliament is feeling more assertive, members are being more demanding, they're working more cross-party, the select committees, the backbench business committee, the election of the speaker. And now we seem to be in a situation where parties have broken down, people are worrying about Parliament having too much power. You know, big questions. There's sort of, have we gone too far in terms of the balance, but also just at the practical level? What do we think we know about what needs to change?
I'll try, and then I hope in discussion, because there are many people here.
Yeah.
I am worried on one level at your last question, and it hasn't gone too far because it hasn't happened yet. But at tactical level, there are some steps that have begun to be made that would worry me in terms of partly public expectation and what the public, and who is judged, what the public actually wants. And there's, I would just say here, we're talking about Parliament, we're entirely talking about the House of Commons.
Yeah.
The House of Lords we haven't heard a squeak from for months, which is good. It's what you would expect. Not this was because in this room they have to keep themselves out of this.
Which is really interesting, because there's one little anecdote which some people in this room will be familiar with from my work on the House of Lords, where one of the things that I've written about a lot is the growing power of the House of Lords post-99 and to an extent post-97, and the way that the Labour government changed things inside government to try and anticipate how the House of Lords would respond, because they were frightened of the policy effects that the House of Lords could have. So that caused me to go back to some people who'd been in the 1974 Labour government and say, did you not do all this? Were you not terribly worried about this overwhelmingly Conservative House of Lords that would get in the way of your policy? And I think I interviewed 2 cabinet ministers from that time who said, you know, we never talked about the House of Lords. We were so worried about the narrowness of our control of the House of Commons that our feeling was if we can sort the House of Commons out, the House of Lords will sort itself out. And it's funny that we're back there now, aren't we? It's minority government.
I guess it's only the Cooper-Letwin-Bowles bill, if it had ever become a bill, would have had some trouble in the Lords. I mean, that was the threat of some Taliban resistance to that.
As allegedly in some newspapers stoked up by certain cabinet ministers,
Yes.
which was one of the most astonishing things I've read in recent months.
All right. I've ceased to be astonished. These things happen, and obviously, but I think we do have to move away from the mess we're in now, and think, what will this look like, as Dr. Johnson said, in a year's time. If you said that to Boswell, just stand back and imagine what it looks like in a year's time. It will look different. I think there's a danger that when we talk about House of Commons taking control, that we sell a false bill of goods and somehow a belief that the outcome for people will be better. Because that's, after all, what most people mind about. So if, for example, the House of Commons felt it was in control of knife crime, what would the difference be? Or of our education system as to whether to have grammar schools or not, if that were ever to, which was a 2015 manifesto issue and was going to be the 2017 one still. Or whatever the latest health concern is social care. Is the funding of social care in a mess because government's in control and no one listens to members? Or do we really believe the House of Commons in control would make a better fist of it if there were sort of committees, executive? We don't believe that, do we? And I don't think most of the public believe that. They don't have such a high opinion of members, who after all make up the House of Commons, as to want to give them control of their lives. So they may enjoy, as I suspect we all do at times, the spectacle of ministerial tails being twisted or tweaked. But I think we have to be careful what the message is as parliamentary observers, officials and certainly as members, what the impression is given to the public outside as to whether that is necessarily a good thing. Having said that, if there is a minority government, if there are also long-term fissures in the two main political parties that are going to lead to something other than a temporary 5-year holiday for a dozen members, which I think is all we've so far seen. I mustn't overstate it. But if that gets bigger, then evidently the House will have to adapt its views, its relationship with ministers in some way. But you're absolutely right, the issue is the relationship between the executive and the legislature when the executive is drawn from within the legislature. We've seen cabinet, we're talking about cabinet ministers in the Lords, we've seen cabinet proceedings being broadcast virtually in real time by tweets, and members thinking it's funny. So I've said to some members, it's not that funny. If it happened in a select committee, well, it would be a contempt, and we would be having these people up in front of the beak. I mean, we couldn't do much, but it would be taken with great gravity to say you must have privacy, and they've lost that. You've got that extraordinary last vote last week, when I think 188 Conservative members voted against the government's motion on seeking an extension, including quite a lot of ministers, and it was only passed because of the Labour Party voting in favour.
Which would have been news a few years ago, but that's sort of
it seemed to be enormous.
Sort of just about been mentioned, doesn't
well,
it?
they're so excited by the 316 to 314 or whatever. That didn't seem to me to be the big vote. The big vote was the amazing that the Conservative Party backbenchers almost universally opposed what was being proposed by the Prime Minister. So if that carries on, yes, and procedure will have to adapt. Has anything, and you'll ask, and I do ask myself, has anything gone wrong procedurally in the last 18 months? Because I set myself the task to ensure the House of Commons, telling everyone for the last 2 years, our job is to make sure that Brexit is properly handled in the House. 4% of the population think the House of Commons is doing a good job on Brexit. so my retirement is well timed. It gives John Benjamin the chance to claim as we rise to 4, 5, 6%. So everybody thinks the House of Commons is making a complete Horlicks of it. They don't say the EU is, or they don't always say the government in English, but the House of Commons is blamed. And that is a great lesson. If you're going to want to take control, you're also going to get hammered if it all goes wrong. So that's maybe a negative note on which to end, but it does make me a little fearful.
Okay, let's hand over to these people who've been waiting very patiently. Yeah, we're turning